So tonight, in case you didn't know, we're talking about the Hopewell Quarry, and the title says Stones to Swimming, because this is a two-part story. Next slide. Back 130 years or more from now, there was a quarry there. That's why it's called the Quarry Swimming Club, surprise, surprise. And the equipment there crushed stone for local roads, so it was called a stone crusher, and that's why the road is called Crusher Road. So now you know. You're welcome. And then people started swimming there because the pit filled in with water, and that eventually evolved into an organized swim club, which is where it's ended up with today. So tonight we have a story of a bunch of entrepreneurs, families, multiple generations of families who sustained and improved and continued this thing until it was finally preserved by the Friends of Hopewell Quarry in 2021. And it is now a preserved space, but also a preserved swim club. So that's pretty cool. So next slide. A little background on the history project, where I'm coming from here. So there are wonderful organizations in town, including the public library, the museum, and the historical society, who are all doing a lot to collect information and materials and archive them and share them. But in addition to that, there's also the history project. The history project is the digital side of the whole thing. So we're grabbing up as much Hopewell history as we can find and digitizing it and getting it online and sharing it, making it freely accessible to everybody. So if you are interested in that kind of stuff, there's a lot of information there. There's over 570 documents and maps. There's over 3,500 images, plus 150 more quarry images. Thank you very much. And a bunch of other stuff. And with that information, I've been able to write some history briefs about local organizations like the library and places like the Hopewell Inn and things like that. So in the past couple of years, I've written 40 history briefs. And if you print them out, they look like this. So there's lots of more information online. If you're interested, you're welcome. You don't have to print it out, because you can just download it. It's all freely available, right? And so I've done 7. This is now the 8th presentation like this that will be online as well. And for the quarry specifically, there are 2 history briefs that will be online really soon now. One on the quarry, one on the swim club. That's 40 some pages. And then the 150 photos and more, okay? So the message tonight is, please help us save our local history before it's lost. And just on this one quest, the amount of material that showed up from all these different people was astounding. And now it's saved and it's archived and it's digitized, and it's going to be in the museum digital collection. It's going to be in the Historical Society digital collection. It's online. So this stuff will not get lost. So if you have stuff, or you know people who have stuff, please get in touch, and we'll do whatever's necessary to preserve it. I'll photograph it, I'll scan it, I'll share it back with you, of course. And if you're done with it, then I can help pass it on to the museum, the library, the historical society, whatever. Okay, so people drop stuff off, I pick up stuff, people mail stuff, people ship stuff over the internet, whatever it takes, okay? And if you're interested in volunteering, all these organizations, as Barbara mentioned, would be happy to take your volunteering. But that's enough of that. Let's talk about, the quarry. Next slide. Thank you, sir. So, this whole story starts with the dirt roads. It's all about the dirt roads. So we're talking about the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and the roads were dirt. And you can see what they look like up here. It's really awful. And people were not happy. Taxpayers wanted the local government to tax them and spend money to make better roads. Sound familiar? Right? It's still going on today. But it's much worse than our roads because, when it got hot, you end up with hard ridges and ruts, which means you have to drive really, really slowly, or you're going to rip your back out or rip your tire off. And in the wet weather, it's just mud pits. And so people were getting constantly stuck in the roads and had to be hauled out. And the newfangled automobiles were particularly susceptible to this. So it was horrible. So there's this great quote in the newspaper: "It's a disgrace, a drawback to the prosperity and booming of Hopewell." And that's 1895. We need better roads. 20 years later, we have a rural mail carrier from Pennington, actually, who wrote a letter to the editor complaining about how awful his rural roads that he had to drive every day was. But he was very smart. He made it about the school children. Think of those poor school children. They're riding those roads every day. And the picture on the top right here is the school wagon. This is the wagon that the kids in Hopewell came to the Model Avenue School, which is right over there, in 1912. And you imagine riding that over dirt roads and ruts and getting out for the mud quagmires. And the other point he made was the kids are spending an extra hour riding back and forth to school. Sounds familiar, right? It's just amazing. So the problem is dirt roads. So what to do? What's the answer? Next slide. There we go. Whoops, I went the wrong way on Zoom. Luckily, you did it right. Thank you, Bob. Okay, so the answer is McAdam Roads. Okay, so here's a wonderful answer. Just use stones. Just lay down stones. So McAdam Roads, and we all sort of recognize that name, come from Mr. McAdam in Scotland, who really, really diligently worked this whole idea. And what he figured out is if you start with some small stones and build a whole layer of small stones, angular stones with cuts, rough cuts, we're not talking smooth round pebbles here, and then you put on another top layer with smaller stones and you compress them, the stones will interlock. The angular parts will fit together and interlock, and you get a solid result. So there's a bag of stones over there you can play with yourself. So these are that kind of stone. And if you squish them up, show this on the video, if you squish them up and then try to turn them, you know, they're pretty rugged. So that's all you need, a pile of the right size stones. That's pretty cool, right? So how do you get those stones? Well, you need to crush rocks. You need a stone crusher. And the device that they probably used at that time is shown in the bottom here. This is the Blake jaw crusher. And the way that works, and this is a wonderful video up on YouTube that's up on my site now. You have a rock hopper. One side is a heavy piece of metal that just stays fixed, and the other side is a piece of metal that moves. And it's in a V kind of shape, and that V is crushing in constantly. So it's just cycling back and forth, back and forth. You drop a rock, it gets caught somewhere in the V, it gets crushed into smaller pieces. The pieces fall down, get caught further below, get crushed further. And when you're done, you have a nice collection of rocks. And that's all you need, just a nice little rock crusher. This was patented in 1858 by Eli Whitney Blake. And yes, he's related, in case you'd noticed that name. And so, good answer. All you need is McAdam Roads. All you need is a rock crusher. Now all you need is rocks, right? Next slide. So what kind of rock do you need? And the general name for the right kind of rock is trap rock. Now you've heard of probably the trap rock quarry in this area. And that's where trap rock comes from. It's a name for a group of rocks that are igneous. They're magma flow, volcanic flow. And when they harden, you end up with a nice, hard, durable rock that breaks apart in these angular forms that we really, really like. And these are used for roads, they're used for railroad track ballast, they're used for breakwaters. And basalt, for example, is a form of this, as is diabase. And we're focusing on diabase because that's what we have around here, which I'll show you in just a second. And so very quickly, a whole bunch of quarries developed in this area to produce crushed stone because the local areas needed crushed stone, and you really didn't want to carry tons of crushed stone with a horse-drawn wagon, all the way across the area. So local quarries made a lot of sense. So there were this is all in the 1890s, Titusville, Rocky Hill, Princeton. Lambertville started its own quarry, and you'll see why in just a second. So where was this rock in Hopewell? Next slide. The answer is all over the place. So this is Hopewell Valley in a geological map, and the, let's call it orange here, is diabase deposits in our area. So that's the Delaware River down the left side between Lambertville and Titusville. And then there's this diagonal of diabase running up from Lambertville in the top corner. That's the Sourland Mountain. Lots and lots of diabase. And that's why Lambertville was perfectly happy making quarries. And then in our area, there were 4 major quarrying areas. So on the left side, the big chunk by the Delaware River is Baldpate Mountain. And we'll talk about these more in a little bit. Just left of that is Bell Mountain, also along the Delaware. In the middle is Pennington Mountain. We don't think of a mountain there off of Pennington anymore, but it was Pennington Mountain, and it's hidden by trees and other stuff now. And then on the right of the map, coming in from the right side, is what's known as the Rocky Hill Ridge. And that's another long run of diabase that starts below Rocky Hill, circles around, comes into Mount Rose, which you see here. And then there's this continued extrusion of that, which is what's highlighted here underneath Hopewell. And that's where we're going to find our Hopewell Quarry. Okay. So first, next slide, let's talk briefly about these other quarries and what's happening there before we talk about our Hopewell Quarry. So the 3 ones that I indicated before, 2 of them were by the Delaware, and that's the Baldpate Mountain and the Mercer County Quarry. So to find those, you start in Titusville, you go north on Route 29, and as you come to Pleasant Valley Road, that whole area to your right is Baldpate Mountain, which you probably know. And in there is a major quarry. Now, Mercer County took ownership of more than 1,000 acres there, and it's now a county park, and they're now working on the quarry and turning that into a recreational area. But if you were a bird, that would be highly visible to you. It's really, really obvious there was quarrying there. Then if you continue north from there on 29, past Pleasant Valley Road, you will come to the building in the bottom left here. That is the Workhouse Quarry. That building is still there by the road, right off the road. It's covered now with much more vegetation and growth, but that building is still there. Mercer County in the 1890s bought a farm there and started a workhouse farm for prisoners to work. And then they started a quarry there to produce stone for the county. And that operated till the mid-1970s. And then the last quarry is on Pennington Mountain. So to find that, you start on Route 31, you go north from Pennington, and just before you turn off to Hopewell on Route 654, you will see a railroad bridge, a railroad siding running over Route 31. And that is the siding that fed the Pennington Quarry, which is still in operation and still making diabase, still making trap rock today. And the picture here shows a crusher there in the 1930s. So when you look at these buildings, you get a sort of a sense of what happens at a quarry. So you start with the big chunks of rock that you somehow separated from a wall of rock. You send them through a crusher and you get smaller chunks of rock. And then you need to filter those into different sizes because you're selling different sizes for different purposes. So these buildings are typically multi-level. They use gravity. So the crusher might be on top and then the small pieces fall down and then they go through a screening process and fall down. And now you have them piled up on the second floor of the building. If you look at this, the bottom floor is open. The truck goes right in there. The cart goes right in there. In some cases, the train car goes right in there. And then you just dump the rock down. So it's a very sturdy building, obviously. So think back to this when we come back to the Hopewell Quarry. So next slide. So now let's talk about Hopewell. And I've been lying to you. Hopewell actually had two quarries. We're not even fully to our quarry yet, believe it or not. So this is the same map. This is the same run of the Rocky Hill Ridge that ran over to Hopewell. And you can see that run of orange there. The road on there is what we would now call Crusher Road. And then there's two red lines going up the middle, bending towards Hopewell. The red line on the left with the hash is the train line. The red line on the right is what we would now call Pennington Hopewell Road, or Route 654. And you see, for example, the road from Pennington to Hopewell does not go straight. It goes north and curves around all this ugly dye-based rock and then goes into Hopewell. And there are two quarries marked on this map with the crossed rock hammer symbol. So the one on the right, which is Crusher Road at Hopewell Pennington Road, is our Hopewell Quarry. And it's identified here as Cope's Quarry because Mr. Cope started quarrying there, as we'll see in a second. The other one is actually a railroad quarry, and it was run by the railroad mainly for their own use. So we need to talk about those two as well. So next slide. So here's another map slightly later that shows, that's a road map. So that this map maker doesn't care at all about geographical features. It doesn't care at all about quarries. It's interested in buildings. So the rectangles here are churches and schools and hotels and stores and homes and farms, okay? So you see two things highlighted on the left. The larger one says Cope's Stone Crusher. So that's not the quarry hole, that's the crusher building that Cope had there to crush stone. And you can see there's a dash line drive leading in there. And then the other one is labeled PNR, Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad Company. And that's not where the quarry was in the previous picture. The quarry is sort of where the X is here, above that and where the railroad line is curving. So that's, again, some building that the railroad had there on the site. And of course, we have no details on that, unfortunately. But these are our two quarries. And we know from these maps that the railroad quarry showed up first because it's in the older maps. And then our quarry showed up. So we can, in the absence of any other evidence, we can date it that kind of way. And so here we are. Okay, next slide. And I'm sorry, all these slides will be online as well. Give me a day or two. So the railroad quarry. So what was the railroad quarry doing? It was making crushed stone just like all these other quarries in exactly the same kind of process. Some of that stone was used for roads, but most of it was used for road ballast for track beds. So if you go out and look at a train track, there's all that rock there, right? And it's packed in around the railroad ties. It's spread around, and it bears the weight, handles the compression, spreads the weight. And that's why you use this kind of rock for railroad ties. And the railroads were expanding and they needed lots of it. And so they found this great site in Hopewell to do that. This was apparently a pretty large operation. We don't have a whole lot of detail, but for example, we have a document which is the railroad's listing of assets for tax purposes. And it lists the Hopewell Quarry as 4 acres and associated stonebreaker building with significant value. By 1897, we have a report from a Hopewell paper that they were running 3 plants and employing 200 people. That's ridiculously large. I'm not at all sure what that's about. They may have had multiple crusher operations going. They may have been chopping away at different pieces of rock at the same time. We don't know. 200 is a ton of people, even if you include people loading train cars and maybe sharing with the local train stations. I don't know. We have a 1901 report that they employed 60 people, which is still a lot of people. But in 1901, the Hopewell paper does report that this quarry was shut down. It was all quarried out. They ripped all the stone they could find out of that ridge of diabase, and they were done, and they had removed the machinery. Okay. So they were done quarrying in 1901, but we have 1905 maps that still show their location. So why are they still there? And what we're assuming is they were there for Cope's quarry as well, because we know Cope shipped by railroad. In fact, we know at some points he shipped much more stone by railroad than for other purposes. So he's probably using that same siding over there. And the railroad's always happy to have a siding if somebody's going to ship stuff on it. So we assume that's what that's there for. Next slide. So finally, we come to Mr. Cope. So what do we know about Joshua S. Cope? Well, Cope was raised in Pennsylvania, lived in Pennsylvania, was a deeply involved Quaker, and at age around 40 in the 1880 census, he was a farmer married in Montgomery County and plugging away being a Quaker farmer. Somehow, in the next 10 years, he turned into a capitalist and invested in a quarry and came to Hopewell to do that. How that all happened, we have no clue. No idea at all. But he was very involved. So we have him in Hopewell by 1981. We have his crusher open in 1982. We have him expanding in 1985. And we have many, many reports in the paper. You see one at the bottom right here. This is Pennington buying large piles of stone from Cope's crusher because people wanted roads, right? And there's always more roads. We have multiple reports from various sources. He employed maybe 20 to 30 people, which sounds like a reasonable number. And he did retire in 1912 at age 70, having lived a very different second half of his life. And he sold the business to Amos Vaughn, who we'll meet in a second. But his name lived on. The paper still, what was it, 20 some years later, was still calling what we call Crusher Road Cope to Mount Rose Road. So he was very visible in the area as a result of that. Okay, next slide, thank you. So what happened there? We talked about what happened at those other quarries with those big buildings. Cope didn't seem to have that extensive a setup. We have no pictures, we have no diagrams. The picture here is actually the Pennington Quarry, but it gives you the sense of what a wall of rock looks like. But it's described in the paper. The reporter for the Hopewell Herald went out and described what happened there, which is really helpful. So there's the cut where you're blowing up rock in order to break it into pieces. There's the stone crushers where you crush it down into smaller pieces. And then there's the bins where you transport it. So what did he have? So he had steam drills drilling 16 feet into the rock face in order to pack it with dynamite and explode, basically rip a layer off the front of the face of the rock. And that was run by 2 different boilers up on the top of the hill, feeding steam down to the drill. And then there were carts, horse-drawn, human-drawn, we don't know, to drag the rocks to the crushers. And there is evidence there were rail tracks on that site later, but we just don't know anything about them, unfortunately. Then the crushers, Cope had 2 crusher machines running side by side. They could break 225 tons of rock a day. That's roughly 2 railroad boxcars. That's a lot of rock. Okay. And that they were run by a boiler and an engine as well. And then he had an elevator to take that rock up to be sorted. So apparently he crushed at ground level and then had a multi-level building to do the sorting. And the last step of sorting, he had a conveyor belt basically that moved the rock over screens and sorted them in 3 different sizes. And then he had 4 teams, 4 additional teams, again, of horses, mules, whatever, carrying that crushed stone to the railway siding. So it's a really, really extensive operation. There's lots of work going on here. And you understand why there's a whole rock wall and a big hole in the ground. They were really chewing up rock. It's very impressive. So next slide. Now we come to Amos Vaughn, who bought the quarry in 1912. Now you can think of Vaughn, we would call him a serial entrepreneur now. He liked to do lots of different things. He started in the Golden Bond Lumberyard, which we now know as Van Dorn's. The space is still operating over on Model Avenue. For a long time, he was a dealer in farm machinery and horses, and he owned farms, multiple farms around town. And like many other of these industrial people at the time, he was active in local affairs. He was on the borough council. He was the justice of the peace. And he was involved economically as well as the director of the National Bank and the Canning Company. So very busy guy, like many of these other people. So the story of his crushery, he bought it in 1912. A 1915 article said he was employing about 15 people, which is less than Cope, if you believe these numbers. But somewhere around 1920, the quarry was closed and the pit had filled with water. We don't have an official statement anywhere about exactly when it closed or why or anything like that. Certainly they had a problem with water coming in. It was also the time period of World War I, which didn't help economic businesses at the time. So he started a residential development plan for part of the quarry property. So the plan you see in the top right here is his Colonial Heights plan for the property between the quarry and the main road there, called Pennington Road. And this is the plan from 1924, which he filed in Trenton, and Trenton still had a copy of this, which is just wonderful. So we have it. But unfortunately, he didn't seem to have much success with that. And in 1928, he filed for bankruptcy. And again, it's not uncommon at this time that people file for bankruptcy. But as part of the bankruptcy process, the quarry property was sold to his brother, William S. Bond. And it's William S. Bond and his family and multiple generations of his family who converted this property to a swimming hole, to a swimming club, and continued it up to today. So the whole rest of this is going to follow that William S. Bond story, okay? So we begin. Next slide. Here's William S. Bond. Now he's another local mover and shaker entrepreneur kind of guy. He moved to Hopewell in 1908 from Princeton. He described himself as a farmer. He was involved locally as a director of the chocolate company. He was deeply involved in the Old School Baptist Church, which is there. And he helped develop the west side of Hopewell. Think of West Prospect Street as a residential area as well. Now, he did own the quarry property, but we have no evidence that he himself was involved in it in any way. And you'll see that in just a second. So he purchased it from his brother in 1928. He died in 1936, and his estate passed his property, and particularly the quarry property, to his 6 children. And it's those 6 children and their further generations that subdivided those 6 pieces of the quarry and continued to operate it until 1977. So the quarry was finally sold out of the Bond family in 1977. And we have a group of that team in the back here tonight. The 2 names that'll come up, so I just want to place them in the chronology here. In 1942, the family named Desi Lee Casey as the operator of the quarry. So he was married to Annie Vaughn, the daughter of William. And then in 1970, again, the family named Forrest Lau to run the quarry. And many of you may know those names. And he was married to Lois Casey, the granddaughter of William Bond. Okay, so that places us in the genealogy. Next slide. So in 1920, the quarry area was starting to be used as an informal swimming pool. So there's no evidence the Bonds were doing anything. involved in it in any way. Kids just were hot in the summer and there was a hole full of water, so they went and swam there. And these two articles on the right from 1922 show the mixed feelings of people in the area about it. The top article says, yeah, it's good the kids are swimming, but it's dangerous. They're jumping off the rock cliffs. They're swimming in cold water. They might cramp and die. This is really, really dangerous. Somebody should do something. And the second article at the bottom right, in the same issue of the same paper, says everybody should go to the quarry because the high school's having a swimming show there. Okay, so party, what can I say? So this informal thing continued, apparently. And there's this article in the bottom left, a kid fell off the cliff, was fine, but his buddies grabbed him and took him to the hospital. He had not broken anything at all, but that happens when you climb cliffs, right? So next slide. Now, from the Vaughn family records, we have some evidence that the Vaughns named Monty Spurtle and Frank Zawitowski to operate the quarry in 1935. And Desi Casey may have been involved at that time as well. Zawitowski was a local phys ed teacher and coach, eventually was athletic director at the high school, and continued to be involved in the quarry and running their lifeguard operations. So the picture in the bottom left, courtesy of the Hopewell Museum, we think is the first image that we have of the quarry. Okay. So when was this taken? We have no dates. So let's follow the reasoning here. So it's really early. There's a car there in the top right. That's a 1928 Model A. So this is probably 30s, right? There's a building there right next to the car, which does not appear in any other picture. So that's probably a leftover quarry building of some sort and came down pretty soon. So, you know, we're somewhere there in the early, maybe 30s, I don't know. The quarry entrance, the getting down to the water is a really rugged process. As you can see there, there's rocks and dirt, and somebody put some kind of ladder system going down to it. But on the other hand, it's organized swimming. Somebody's built at least one diving board. There's a raft out there. I don't see anybody doing lifeguarding, but oh well. But this place is somewhat organized for swimming. People are coming here for that purpose. I don't see any fences protecting it. Maybe people were asked to contribute to pay the lifeguard, for example, that kind of thing. So here we are. That's 1935. Next step. So just a quick overview of the quarry property. This is from a survey that was done for the Friends of the Quarry. So the top blue area there is the quarry pit lake, and the bottom of the V of that blue is the entrance that we just looked at, where you enter the water. And there's eventually there are 4 diving boards there. And there's a guard hut that appears in the later pictures right by the entrance. The big new change, as we'll come to, is that in-ground pool that was put in. It's called the kiddie pool often because it's for people who can't swim in the deep quarry. So it's kids and families and people learning to swim and that kind of thing. And then there's a fence along the bottom there, and all those buildings are pretty much piled up along the fence, which separates the quarry property from the parking area. Okay, so this is what we will see in future pictures going forward. Next slide. So now we're in 1941. So in 1941, the Bond family organized a business to run the quarry, and they called it the Quarry Swimming Club, except when they forgot and they called it the Quarry Swim Club, but ignore that little detail. And right in the midst of World War II, they decided they should start a business and invest in the quarry as a swim club, which is sort of fascinating. And so they tapped Desi Casey, as we've already mentioned, to be the director. He's there in the bottom left with his family and his wife, Annie. And the first thing they did was they built this large swimming pool, which was apparently the first pool in the area and cost $194 to build. Oh my gosh. And then Desi ran it for almost 30 years, whole series of additional enhancements and building. A lot of work on fencing because they had to fence out the property and stop kids from coming in and trying to drown in the pool and nobody was there. Desi was also involved in the American Red Cross and had regular water carnivals at the site. So the picture in the bottom right is the huge crowd that showed up for one of the water carnivals where they're doing diving and swimming and boating demonstrations. The quarry was open 10 to dark and had a rated capacity of about 1,000 people, which sounds like a whole lot of people. I see people shaking in the audience here. But you'll see that number again later. It's not totally insane. Next slide. So here's some photos from that 30-year time period. Upper left, the quarry frozen over, and a water tower in the background there that we know nothing about. And it's clear cut up there as well. So what was going on there, we don't know. In the bottom right is the canonical view that we've already started to see. So what do we see here? The big thing is the swimming pool in the top right. And coming down from the swimming pool, there's that entrance area to the lake, which is still dirt, but it's a little bit more organized. The water level is still very low compared to today. You'll see that in a second. There's a lifeguard shed there between the pool and the entrance area with a flat roof. And it's got more amenities. There's 2 rafts, 1 on each side. There's 2 diving boards, 1 on each side. There's the beginning of some structures in the back and a lot of 1930 cars in the parking lot. And then the bottom left, later, the shed now has an angular roof and there are concrete steps there, which later and now are totally underwater. Okay, so next slide. So in 1970, the Casey stepped back and Forrest Lau, the next generation of the Bond family, stepped up and was named manager of the quarry. And the quarry then was open 11 to 6. They were charging $2 per person a day or $3 on a weekend. And they did have monthly fees, so you could buy a month of tickets at a time. But by 1976, he too was worn out. Nobody else wanted to do it. The next generation of the Bonds family was not interested in running a quarry, thank you very much. And so it was offered for sale for $85,000 in 1976. So next slide. Some images of that time on the left, all that dangerous rock diving, people diving off, people jumping off, people climbing rocks. Kids love to do this. And then on the right is the Quarry Overlook, and you can see it's just much more, let's say, landscaped. It's a much nicer looking area, and the water level is significantly higher, which is close to where it is today. Okay. Next slide. So now the quarry passes off from the Bond family to the next generation of people who wanted to do this. And the first was Bill James. So Bill James, that's Bill and his wife Janet in the top right, was raised in Pennsylvania, visited the quarry a lot, brought his girlfriends to the quarry, so he had that good feeling about it. He had some businesses in Trenton and some young kids, but his businesses were hands-off businesses. So he decided, heck, I'll run the quarry. It'll be a good thing to do with my kids in the summer. So he leased it in 76 and he purchased it in 1977. He made a whole nother series of repairs to the property. The big news for people who went to the quarry was the old outhouses were replaced with bathrooms. You're welcome. I imagine that was greatly appreciated. And he talks about, with real joy about the quarry, a typical day might be 50 to 150 people, but he did have days with 1,000 people, which were just crazy to manage, as you might guess. In 77, when he started, he was still charging $2 a day. And he had annual rates, $75 for individuals, and then family rates for adults and children. But he talks glowingly about the great experience of being there and running it, and particularly how good it was for families. So the parents would show up with the kids in the morning and throw them out of the car, and James would be running arts and crafts camps and things like that for the kids. Then at lunchtime, the quarry had its lunchrooms, the snack bars, so they could have their lunch. And then they play all afternoon. They swim and play all afternoon, and the parents would eventually show up and take them home. That's a good deal for everybody, right? So he speaks with real joy about that time. So next slide. So we have some pictures, a sense of the fun of the time. Kids playing in the pool, kids playing in the water. And then the picture on the right is this great scene of what you do in that water. So on the left, kids play with the inner tubes. In the center front, kids are swimming. In the center back, kids are playing on the rafts. In the center right, kids are on the diving board. You know, what more can you ask for? And that's what the quarry's about, and it's still about today. There is a roped off area in the back right that you may notice. That's because of falling rocks in that area. Okay, next slide. So then the next group who took it over were the Gibsons, Jim and Nancy Gibson, who ran it for over 30 years. Just an amazing, amazing effort in their part. James was thinking about selling the property. He knew the Gibsons were involved in real estate, so he consulted with them, and then they decided, hey, we'll do this too. Why not, right? And so they made a whole bunch of changes as well. One thing they did was cover some of these concrete block buildings with wood and put on nice roofs. So the bottom center picture gives you a sense of that. That was about. And Nancy talks about grabbing up the Pennington kiosk. The kiosk in the bottom right there that stood at the quarry was actually originally in Pennington, and the town decided they didn't want it. So Nancy grabbed it and took it out to the quarry. So by 92, the quarry was open 11 to 6, $5 a day. But by 2001, the crowds had gotten too crazy. The place had gotten too unruly. So they instituted private memberships. So seasonal rates, monthly rates, 10-pack rates, things like that, just not daily rates for the place. And you can see the prices got up to $850, $900 a family, and that by the 2010s. Next slide. So here's some visuals of the Gibson period. Top left. Oh my gosh, the soap opera came to Hopewell. One Life to Live. One Life to Live was filmed in Hopewell and in Princeton, of course. And these two characters, I don't know their names, maybe you do, but you may not want to admit it, came to the quarry and discovered their love for each other. So maybe that clip's on YouTube somewhere, I don't know. You can chase it down for me. The other big event was the 1991 lumberyard fire, the Vandal lumberyard fire, which was huge. And basically the fire company was running out of water. Hopewell only had so much water up in the hills. So they started shuffling it from the quarry. They had a chain gang of pumper trucks bringing water in and dumping it to share. And Jim Gibson says the quarry went down about half a foot by the time they were done. They pulled a lot of water. And if you saw, they set up basically big inflatable swimming pools to hold the water till they pumped it into the fire. And there were fish swimming in those pools too. Oh, well. On the bottom, we have a couple fun pictures from Nancy Kennedy, just to give a sense again of that period. People hanging out on the lawn, and the bottom right, all those inner tubes that we've already been seeing. Okay, next slide. So finally, we come to the friends of Hopewell Quarry. So the Gibsons were ready to retire by 2014. Jim was age 78. Oh my gosh. and still doing this every summer. And they really didn't want to sell out to a developer. So they spent a lot of time talking with different groups, trying to figure out how to do something. And then meanwhile, in 2016, 2017, the Friends of Hopewell Quarry was organized as a nonprofit to both to fundraise and to find a way to make this happen. And in 2021, with the help of Green Acres funding. And the quote at the bottom is from Catherine Dresner. The Hopewell Quarry property is permanently preserved open space. It's tax exempt under Green Acres. It's public land, a public park, regulated by Green Acres and operated by the nonprofit Friends of Hopewell Quarry in the public interest. So it's preserved, it's safe. And that's what the Gibsons and the Friends were able to do together. So we're very lucky. The 2023 rates are here. You can see it's similar to what the Gibsons were doing in their time. So next slide. So a whole lot of thanks. I do want to bore you with the thanks, but thank you. The Friends of Hopewell Quarry, and particularly Lindsay Young-Lockett, who does a lot of that dirty work there to make stuff happen. Catherine Dresner. Bill James and Nancy Gibson, the former owners, were very helpful. And then Marshall Lau and Julie Osborne and that bond contingent who are here tonight were tremendously helpful. They had family records and scrapbooks and slides and photos and memories. And this was much more work than I thought it would be, thanks to them. So that was great. The photographers, and you can see some of their work on this page. Nancy Kennedy took a lot of wonderful photos more recently. And then Rich Anderson, who's here tonight, and Terry Devlin took a bunch of pictures, particularly in time periods that we didn't have other pictures. So that was tremendously helpful as well. Sal Torre and the American Legion Post had a whole bunch of memories as well. Sandy Milburn, who's here tonight, was our resident geologist to explain about dye base. And there's some dye base over here if you want to go scratch the rock yourself. And thanks also to the Hopewell Museum I mentioned earlier, who had that wonderful first photo of the quarry to show. So that's the story. So it's summarized here on this page. We do have time for questions. If you're on Zoom, please type your question in and Bob will relay it to the front. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Yeah.
So I have a question, and it seems to be every quarry. You talked about how they blast straight into the walls, cutting the walls with blast that go off later. Why is it that they always have that pit? Are they working down in that pit? Like why do they go straight down onto the steep level?
Yeah, dye base is volcanic rock that's in big ridges, basically. And it's stronger than other kinds of surrounding materials. So over eons, everything else wears away and the dye base sticks out. But not all of it sticks out, some of it's underground. So if you're lucky, you get a lot of it sticking out above ground level and you could just go straight into it. But then there's more underground and you got to go down and get it. It's not like, you know, going down in a gold mine or something, going way down, but you got to go down till you run out of what you're digging. So that's why quarries go in and also down into the ground. Nice. Yeah.
It seems that the water is very stable through like 1960. But when I got in 1980, it was as high as it is now. You know what made that difference?
I need to.
Stable and high.
Yeah, what's going on with the water level? Not sure. It's not like this is a pond with an inlet and an outlet. It's not like somebody's regulating the water level in there. Part of it may have to do with the ground level. I don't know, and I need to find some people who can tell me. So yeah, water level's very good question. Joe.
So did you happen to find much documentation of the workers at the quarry, my impression is that, and I don't know that it's what it's doing,
But it's a lot of the Italian families who think to work in the quarry. And when building is up on the staff of church, there's also a problem with that was from the town. And they don't have seen one census record, and I haven't copied it on I'm not sure if it's 1900 or 1895, 1905. But it actually lists the local of the quarry. Fortunately, however, they listed that Italian number one for Italian number third. Their names are actually not getting, I don't know if they, the census taker didn't get the information or the foreman didn't even know that they
Didn't even have, yeah.
Either way, they just listed as Italian one through 30.
Yeah.
If you're really interested to know who the family, I mean, I'm sure the loud probably knows the families that are working there, but it'd be really interesting to kind of get an understanding of who the families were that came to work at the quarry, and who the years not possible.
Yeah, who are the families at the quarries? Yeah, I didn't know they were listed in the census, never occurred to me, because it's a business, they must have all,
Walk through everything on.
Yeah. oh, okay, yeah.
And I think that was.
Chasing, yeah,
Buildings with the list.
right,
of families that would be very interesting to think.
yeah. There are some mentions of who was foreman there. The article that talked about what it was like to process rock there did explicitly name the gentleman who ran all the machines, because they were the most important people there, keeping those machines running. And then there's some articles about people injured in accidents and things like that. So yeah, if you dug a little further, you could start mapping that out. But no, I did not go there. That's really interesting, the connection to St. Alphonsus. So thank you. Yeah. In the back?
There is another quarry.
Yeah, there is other quarries. Yeah, there is at least one other quarry, actually an Anderson quarry, further up Crusher Road near Mount Rose.
Yeah.
And we know a little bit about it. And there's somebody here who's partially related to that family, actually. But we don't know a whole lot about it. It started later. And some of these quarries went into more competition with each other. The Pennington Quarry was doing a lot of work. And then the Mercer Workhouse Quarry was undercutting the other quarries because it was giving away rock for free to possible customers. So it may have been difficult to run a quarry later in this period. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I might be able to give a little bit of insight into the question about water levels.
Yeah, water levels, right?
It's actually, it's not always working. There's a 4-inch line in the pump that flows the water out towards the house that houses the chlorine and the filtration system.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, so when the level gets high, that pump intentionally lowers. So there is sort of a funky rudimentary.
Okay, a leveling
But
mechanism,
I'm
yeah.
not sure if it's working like that. I think we had it cleaned out maybe a year ago.
Oh, okay.
But that might give a little bit of insight.
Yeah,
It's not straightforward. There's actually a part of the way to deal with
Right.
pumps.
Yeah, there is a pump house and they pump water out of the quarry to the swimming pool, for example. That was a big use. And there was a well there and they were sharing water with local houses, apparently.
Yeah, well,
So-
there's out by before.
Yeah. The well's out by the major road, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly what's happening there, not clear. Yeah,
Same thing, I wonder if maybe use the quarry as a source of water for local houses, local farms. Any idea that
yeah, the quarry is a source of water. I don't see any suggestion of that. There is the one picture with the water tower in it. And there was the well and the pump, which did serve local houses. So it's not clear whether they actually used quarry water as potable water. Yeah. Yeah, hi.
So that, other railroad quarry that you talked about, that I guess is kind of maybe on the ground, the, either together property?
Yeah, it's back behind there. Yeah.
Actually, when you say it's all quarried out, is it flat, like it's not really a mountain anymore, it's just, like, is there a hole in the ground somewhere? Or-
Yeah, if you look at the topographic maps, there was a large bunch of rock there. And now there's much less rock there. I mean, there's no question about it. But it's, you know, it's gone. Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
just in bars.
Yeah. We're talking about the railroad quarry here, sorry. Sir, yeah.
Typically, Gibson has great sense of humor, and regarding the water lane, they were trying to like, they came in and began, whether they would tell the lifeguards, fully control of the water. You have to dive down.
Okay, I have to repeat that for the recording and the people online. Nancy Kennedy says that Nancy Gibson would prank the new lifeguards to tell them to lower the water level by diving into the quarry and pulling the plug to let water out. Thank you very much. And it worked every time. Every time. And those people still came to work the next day. That's the amazing part, right? Oh, airing out the inner tubes. Ew. Yeah. Yes, sir.
They also went the other way. And the garden was still in the contract, and so the one of them was too low, and that's all over to put out.
Oh, okay, yeah. Or go to the pump and fill up the quarry. Great, thank you very much. Well, we're a little over time here. Are there questions from online, Bob?
Yeah, there's a few, I'm not sure if you got that.
Yeah,
Hearing, but, what person actually standing on the dial was seriously injured at the park?
anybody died or seriously injured? There was one person who drowned in the quarry. And, they had to get a guy out with a diving suit to go get him. But I think that's the only one I've heard. I don't remember.
Another question is, was the quarry ever open outside?
No, as far as I know, the quarry was only open, Memorial Day, Labor Day kind of range. Some of these people had school jobs, for example, to go back to. The kids certainly who worked as lifeguards wouldn't have been available as well. The quarry now is open off-season as a place you can go, not to swim, but to enjoy the park. Any others, Bob?
Yeah, one other question, how did the little fish get into the water?
How did the what? How did the little fish get into the water? Osmosis. Probably came from the bigger fish, or the birds brought them in, the stork brought them in. Yeah, thank you very much. On that note, are there any other burning questions, or shall we call it? Okay. One last question. Yeah.
Deputy Casey was so passionate about water safety, the annual show was a big deal about it.
Yeah, Desi Casey. Yeah, I talked about his water shows, but they were also definitely about water safety as well. So thank you. Okay, that's enough.